Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Agile Requirements and Development Management from User Story to Test Case. My name is Ben Hrumpli. I'm going to be hosting your webinar today. I'm from Inland Software. All right, so let's get started. What is on the agenda today? First of all, I'm going to be presenting the Agile Lifecycle from requirements to release. And what that looks like. Then I'll talk about Agile best practices, techniques, and tools that you can use for the management of an Agile development process. And then we'll talk about how you can manage Agile life cycles with a next generation ALM tool like codeBeamer. And then that will obviously be followed by a live demonstration of codeBeamer ALM as well. Okay, so just a few words about the webinar. The live demo will be followed by a Q&A session so you can ask your questions. The webinar will be recorded and you can watch it again on inland.com/webinars and events, and that's also where you can register for our upcoming webinars. So this is actually part one of our Agile summer classes. On August 16th, we will have part two, Agile and Safety Critical Development and Medical Case Study. On the 30th of August, we'll have the third one, and the fourth one on the 13th of September. So you can register for all those on our website. Okay, so let's get started. What you see here, this is a visualization of an Agile lifecycle, which starts here at the big start sign. This is where the project initiates and where you can define your high-level requirements. So that's how it starts. Then you define from that usually your user stories, and you break that down into tasks, and the development begins. First part one of your first functionality, which is then followed by the testing of that functionality. And then you go on and you develop functionality 2, which is then followed with integration and testing, and then functionality 3, 4, and so on. And every function development is always followed by integration and testing. So that's kind of like a small waterfall, basically. You have the same steps: design first, or defining of your requirements in the design phase. Development, integration, and testing is just in smaller iterations. Okay, and then after you're complete with that, that is followed with a release, feedback review, acceptance, and if it is accepted, then after a final integration and testing stage, it is released to the market. If it is not accepted, then you can record and incorporate changes and adjust and track and go on to the next iteration, and the life cycle starts over. Okay, and the main benefits of this Agile model is usually faster return on interest for everybody, continuous planning and feedback during development. The client can see the software in action and tweak requirements during the development, and more transparency and better visibility of what's happening for all the stakeholders, so the developers, clients, and the users. Okay, so I'm not going to talk a lot more about the basics of Agile. We have plenty of webinars on that. I just wanted to give a short introduction of an example of an Agile lifecycle. Okay, and then I'd like to continue by mentioning that one of the most important and fundamental aspects of developing embedded software is requirements management. Requirements engineering has one of the most significant roles in managing and documenting software and hardware requirements and improving products development when used correctly. The efficiency and accuracy of this process is vital to project success because, and we've emphasized this, or I've emphasized this in a lot of my webinars, bad requirements is the single biggest reason for project failure, statistics show. So in fact, requirements at the very root of the transition, or at the very root of the transition process that is considered by some as revolutionary to the way we develop software. And this evolutionary process gave rise to Agile, and thus requirements can be seen as the main driving force behind Agile's growing adoption and popularity. Okay, and then let me continue by clarifying a few differences in terminology. More specifically, what you see here, the difference between requirements and user stories, because I believe the difference isn't completely self-explanatory. So requirements are criteria like constraints, conditions, or capabilities that the system must adhere to. Good requirements need to be complete, testable, consistent, design-free, and unambiguous. And requirements presume that the design of the application is done beforehand and that the development is the implementation of that design. So requirements therefore focus on how to implement the functionality, performance, and user experience, and are differentiated through functional and non-functional requirements. And I'll talk about the differences of that a little bit later. But a user story, on the other hand, is just a promise to have a future conversation about a feature that the user wants. So it's not meant to document every aspect of the work, as you might see in a series of traditional requirement statements. They're just rather a reminder to collaborate about the topic of the user story. So in other words, as defined in the Agile Manifesto, the documentation is secondary to the collaboration and the interaction between the client and the product owners. Okay, so user stories focus on what to achieve and their collaboration between these two people that I just mentioned. So product owner usually, and client and developer. That's three people. Okay, so user stories insist that the design of the product be done at the last minute and the details are decided during the implementation based on the opportunities. Okay, so those are the two fundamental differences between requirements and user stories. Also, user stories are told from the user's perspective typically, and they're shortened to the point and written in plain language, but they should also be unambiguous if can be. And they should describe the capability that the user wants, speak to the reason for the change and anticipated benefits, and be delivered in whatever way the user wants. So it doesn't have to be, it can be handwritten in email, sticky notes, so that there's no real rules or guidelines for that. And the user story, or a good written user story, is usually accompanied by acceptance criteria. Also, a good user story follows this INVEST model that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. And this stands for independent, making it easier to plan. Negotiable, allowing details to be added during collaboration and some wiggle room. Valuable, providing value for the customer. Estimable, so not too vague. And small, meaning it can be done in about a week or less by the team, and having good acceptance criteria, which means being testable. Okay, so acceptance criteria are criteria used to determine whether the user story has met the goal or need of the user. But it's important to keep in mind here that involving testers, or at least communicating decisions made by the product owner or customer, is a good idea so the user stories don't lack completeness. All right. Most people argue that user stories by themselves replace the purpose of functional requirements, while well-defined acceptance criteria can take the role of non-functional requirements, making the user stories complete. So that's the relationship between user stories and requirements. But again, there's no clear-cut process of agile requirements management, but one common practice is to have requirements and user stories, because a user story is only meant to describe a feature, but not describe how to implement it, meaning leaving out the technical aspect. It should describe the behavior or flow from the user's perspective. On the other hand, our development team here at Intland, for example, uses Scrum, which is something that I will talk about in more detail a little bit later, and we don't use requirements at all. So what we do is we define user stories, tasks, and then change requests. And we receive our user stories and define acceptance criteria for each user story. If something needs to be changed, we track change requests separately. So in our case, those two are the most similar to requirements, user stories and change requests. Okay, and it's all about how you define your internal processes, actually. So our user stories and change requests are then further decomposed into specific tasks, each with well-defined DODs, or definition of done's. So when is the task complete? And if you're going to apply both requirements and user stories in your development process, then the requirements would somewhere be on a higher level than user stories, between epics and user stories if you're managing epics as well. Okay, so now that we've clarified that, let's steer back to requirements and their significance in Agile. First of all, how does requirements management become Agile? Well, it doesn't really. At least, like I said, there's no agreed upon comprehensive definition of Agile requirements management. It's an evolving collection of practices, and most of these Agile methods have emerged with a focus on implementation. So although Agile has made many important contributions to requirements management, a mature and comprehensive Agile requirements management approach is still lacking, which means that, or in my opinion, which means that every project or organization should adopt its own suitable approach to Agile requirements management. Okay, so having said that, there are blueprints of recommended Agile lifecycle management best practices like Scrum. Scrum is good for transferring knowledge through better collaboration and interactive information exchange. The team members make a better contribution to a common goal rather than just one single person trying to reach the same goal individually. Reviewing requirements needs to be managed as an ongoing process of collaborative meetings, such as the daily or weekly meetings in the Scrum approach. A typical mistake sometimes here is that even teams members and people are working together, and the Agile team tries to collect and implement the requirements straight from the stakeholders instead of using the proven methods of elicitation, discovery, and validation. Then usually a project manager who is responsible for collaboration is needed so the team understands clearly what to do. So just like in a waterfall or traditional V model development, there is a project manager, but they're called Scrum Masters. So elements like agile planning, sprints, and daily stand-up and retrospective meetings are also needed, where the Scrum Master, as the product owner, leads these meetings. Scrum is set out in short time boxes and is driven by sprints. What you see here, they're usually 2 to 4 weeks, and Scrum provides a structure that allows teams to deal with the difficulty of collaboration and information loss. So using Scrum, product development occurs in small pieces, with each piece building upon previously created pieces. So that's what I showed you in the first slide in the lifecycle management of having the development of the functionalities, then having integration and testing after each development sprint, or development of each functionality, rather. Okay, and building these products one small piece at a time encourages creativity in the team, and it enables them to respond to feedback and change, to focus and build exactly and only what is needed, so they don't lose the scope and the focus of the development. However, the fundamental process is incredibly simple, and it's at its core is governed by 3 primary roles. The product owner, who is important, they have the responsibility to create and manage the product backlog and provide requirements and all of the necessary assets to fulfill requirements. They're essential to a successful project. Sorry, I was confusing project manager with, I said product owner instead of project manager, but now I'm saying product owner. So Scrum Master is the second person. They are the head of the development team and cooperate with the product owner, and they define the scope of releases and sprints and create user stories based on original requirements and manage the daily stand-up and retrospective meetings. So I compared Scrum Master with the project manager from a waterfall instead of product owner. So product owner is also part of the Scrum development. And then, of course, the last role, so to speak, are the developers and the development teams, who are obviously essential to the development of a product. Okay, and moving on to visualizations, which is basically another tool that you can use when developing Agile. They enable you to understand information much faster and easier, as you can see here. On the left-hand side, the burn-down chart is a very effective planning tool to interpret the metrics and velocity, or in other words, the rate of progress of a Scrum team. Which is basically Velocity is calculated when you have a sprint and you finish 200 story points, for example, in that time. Then you know that your velocity is 200 story points, and then you can plan for the next sprint with 200 story points. That can change, obviously, but it gives you a better idea of how you can plan for that. And story points is basically just a vague term for effort. So it can be hours, it can be days. What's important is that you break down or decompose your user stories and tasks in similar effort. So each task should be between 4 to 6 story points or something like that. It doesn't have to be, but it makes it easier to plan. Okay, and then by presenting the requirements on a visual board, user stories and tasks, everything on a visual board called a Kanban board, what you see on the right-hand side, the relationship, current status, and responsibilities can be overviewed and managed very easily. And early feedback from the stakeholders can be included and discussed quickly. This applying this Kanban methodology helps developers visualize and manage the workflow by letting you track and move issues and trigger status changes along the defined and agreed workflow. So usually you have 4 columns: to do, in progress, to verify, and done, and then the different items, the workflow statuses of the different items are all mapped to a column. So you can actually manage requirements, user stories, tasks, change requests, everything on one board and see who is working on what. You usually define work in progress limits, and if you see that one column is overwhelmed with too many items or too many story points or too much effort, then usually best practice is that the team swarms in on that column and starts working on only the items that are in that column that are overburdened, so to speak. Okay, so yeah, everything can be monitored here and reported basically, and enhanced flow is ensured, so to speak. So when something is finished, the next highest thing from the backlog can be pulled in to take its place if you don't have any overburdened columns. Okay, so these two, the Scrum and the Kanban, are the most widely used because Kanban isn't just a visual tool, it's actually also a methodology, so a way to work. And Scrum and Kanban are both agile approaches and can be used perfectly together for boosting your requirements management. And I'll be showing you how you can do that with an ALM tool. Both have their benefits, and we believe that a combination of the two helps you increase quality, work just in time, shorten lead time, and helps you continuously improve your processes by minimizing waste due to eliminating everything that is not adding value to your customer. Okay, and then how you can do this with CodeBeamer. So on the left-hand side, what you see here is our CodeBeamer Orchestra, which shows you the different modules that encompass or that can be used in CodeBeamer and the different functionalities that are in these modules. So it actually follows roughly a life cycle of a product or a development from the left-hand side, starting with demand management, then through to requirements management, software and hardware development, QA and test management, and release and DevOps. So the entire life cycle of your product can really be managed in a holistic solution. And it's flexibly configurable, so it's independent of the methodology that you use to develop your product. So you can set it up in a way that you develop in an agile way, in a hybrid or a traditional waterfall and B model. So it's very flexible, but of course you can encompass this with your agile layer, with your Scrum and Kanban methodology. Okay, so that's basically it for the slides. So now I would jump into the live demonstration of how you can manage this with CodeBeamer. But before I do that, I would like to ask you a question. If you could answer the quick poll on your screen that you see here. In what parts of the development lifecycle are you currently using Agile? Please select one of the following. Requirements management, testing and QA, DevOps, the entire lifecycle, or none. Okay, great. Thank you for voting. Okay, and then what more? What is the size of your organization's team or department that you're planning to transition to Agile? If you're planning to transition, if not, then it's not a very. If you're already using Agile, then it's not very relevant. Or if you're already Agile, then what is the current size of your organization? Thanks, and just one last one. What is the preferred time frame of implementing Agile in your organization if you're looking to transition? Great, thanks for voting. Okay, let's jump into CodeBeamer and let me give you a live demonstration. I see I already have a few questions. I'll answer them at the end, so that's when we'll have our Q&A, but I see I already have a few. Okay, so what you see here, this is already CodeBeamer. It's a CodeBeamer project. So usually you manage projects, and projects in a CodeBeamer can be anything that you define as a project. So it can be an entire development of a product, or it can be a partial development of a product, maybe a software development, and the hardware development would be managed in separate projects. So it's what you define as a project. And I'm already in a project now, so this is one that I've created as an Agile Lifecycle management project, so I can demo this, the functionalities of CodeBeamer to you in this webinar. And it actually uses our enlists in Scrum project template as a basis, as a fundamental template. And each project, just like this one, has a wiki page. So you can actually define your processes here. You can define everything that the members of this project need to know about this project, how they should develop, and things like that. For example, this Scrum project template defines what features are included, how everything is configured. It describes what is Agile in short, a few process frameworks. What I talked about, the Kanban process, is described here in a little bit, and how that is implemented into this template. The Scrum process as well. Agile planning, how you can do that with user stories, releases, sprints, and backlogs, and things like that. And this is also where you can actually create dashboards where you can visualize, you can report on everything in this project, across projects even, and then you can visualize that data on dashboards that you put into these actual start pages of your project. Okay, so there's also an integrated document management, but actually the centerpiece of each project are the trackers. So that's where you do your everyday work, basically. They're kind of like folders for your items, and that's where you can manage the actual development of this project or product. And the way I have it set up is, like I said, it's just basically a folder with different configuration sets. And the way I have it set up is you define requirements. I have user stories here and requirements, so you can actually have kind of requirements describing the technical parts and the user stories defining the functionality that the user wants. But you can also extend this with epics, for example, that would be on a higher level above requirements. And then you could define or derive requirements and user stories from those epics. And then the requirements and user stories can be broken down into tasks. They can be broken, or they can be change requests can be managed separately, bugs can be reported, and so on. And then in the config items, in the second part, that's where the testing is done, so the validation and verification of your development. Okay, so it's really an entire application lifecycle management tool. So you can derive test cases from your requirements and user stories. Every tracker has its own workflow. So for example, change requests can go through a change control board, and that process can be implemented into the workflow of change requests. Requirements and user stories need to be accepted, and only then will they be decomposed into tasks with separate definition of dones and acceptance criteria. So that's the way this is set up right now. So if I go into my requirements tracker, this is what it looks like. On the left-hand side, I have my requirements. The hierarchy of my requirements in a tree structure. In the middle, I have the requirements themselves with a summary and a description. And on the right-hand side, I have the attributes of each requirement. So if I select one here, I see the attributes, and these are basically just fields that are completely configurable. And this is something that I imported from a Word document, but you have a bunch of import options. So you can actually start adding your requirements here in the system directly, or you can import from Doors, first of all, which is a native Doors bridge that allows you to import requirements. Or you have a different few Microsoft Office options to import. So you can import from Word, Excel, Project, or a CSV file. Or you can obviously just start defining requirements directly here in the system. So like I said, each tracker has a workflow where you can configure and define your processes. So if I go into the workflow diagram here, you can see that this is the workflow I've defined for requirements. And this is completely configurable on the user interface. And this is where you can really enforce and automate processes. Okay. All right, and then the way it's set up is that everything has the trackers have a link between each other. So what you can do is you can actually derive items from one another, and that also creates automatically a reference. And that way you have this gapless end-to-end traceability all the way down to the source code if needed. So if I click on this plus sign, that allows me to derive an item from this requirement. So I can further derive a user story from here. I can generate a test case that will verify this requirement, or I can break this down into specific tasks. Change requests can be reported and so on. Then I can jump down into user stories. So if I go into my requirements and I click on the plus sign here, and I click on user stories, that allows me to generate a user story from this requirement. So user story for Agile Webinar will be my summary. And here in the link to requirement attribute, you can see that it's referencing upward to the requirement that I'm deriving this from. So if I click on save, and I now jump into my user stories tracker, here at the bottom, I can see the one that I've just generated, user story for Agile Webinar. And here on the right-hand side in the properties, in the relations tab, I have a reference upwards to the requirement that I derived this from. Okay, so that's how I have my traceability. And then this can then be further broken down into specific tasks. So navigation system task, something like that. And now through the subject field, it's referencing upward to the user story that I'm decomposing. So I click on save, and here in the tasks tracker, I have this one that I've just created, this navigation system task. and then this can be assigned story points, and that's how it's usually broken down. Okay, and the way the traceability looks is I'm going to start from my highest level, so from my requirements, and I want to trace down through user stories and then tasks, or I want to see the test cases that verify them, so I can configure a traceability matrix to show the dependencies between all of my items in my development cycle. So if I jump into this dedicated traceability browser, then what I can do is I can add just levels of trackers here, and that will show me all the dependencies between all of the items in these trackers. So my initial tracker is where I start my trace from requirements, and then to level 1 I just add my second tracker, which in this case will be user stories, and then to level 2 I will add tasks. And then if I click on show dependencies, my first one is this navigation interface. This is the user story that I derived from my requirement, and then this is this task that I derived from my user story. Okay, and then I can start adding, of course, more levels to this. So if I want to see the test coverage, for example, we have another dedicated browser for that, but I can add several trackers to one level. So let's say I also want to see the test cases and the user stories of my requirements. Okay, I don't have any, but maybe I have some here. I can add to the second level, which shows me the user stories. No, okay. So we actually have a better dedicated browser for that. So if I go into my requirements and I go to the test coverage browser, then that will also show me the coverage of my requirements here. But what I can do is, so I can show you what this looks like, I'll just generate a requirement here live from the system, so this navigation interface, and I want to verify this with a test case. So I would do the same thing as I would derive a user story from here. I would click on plus and click on generate test case, and then here at the bottom, if I refresh the page, I should see a coverage here, but I don't. Okay, so this must be a configuration issue. Okay, so let's try with user stories. I can generate a test case here. Okay, so that's the way it was set up, sorry. So I'm testing user stories, not my requirements in this case, but usually what you would do is you would test requirements and user stories. They would just have different types of validation verifications. Okay, so this was a configuration setup. Here in the user story, I now have this test case in the incoming references, and now I can see the coverage of my user stories here. My first one is then covered with this test case. I see all of my user stories, and if they're covered with test cases, here I can see a statistical overview, and then I can also see the runs of these test cases. So if they passed or they failed the execution of these, I would see here as well. I'm not going to execute any right now because that would take up even more of our time. But we have a bunch of other webinars and videos that show the entire test management of codeBeamer. Okay, and you can of course export this coverage browser to Microsoft Word or Excel, as well as the traceability browser also, and you can filter this test coverage as well. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to show is the releases, because then that's where you can actually really plan your releases and plan when you want to complete your tasks, group them into the user stories, use the Kanban board and things like that. So I have this release 1 here, Electric City Car Systems release, and this is, here I see on the dashboard a statistical overview of how my release is doing. So I see I have 3 sprints, none of them are closed yet. I've committed 71 story points, 52 items in 19 hours, and this is how much I've completed of that. And this is always based on the items that I've assigned to this release. So this planning is done on the item level. Usually I break the tasks into story points, or assign story points to the tasks, or assign hours to the tasks, and of course the number of items are also calculated. So this is the average of these 3 sprints is calculated upwards into here. And if I click on this plus, I will see all of the user stories, requirements, tasks, bugs, anything that I have assigned to this sprint. Here I can see how many story points are assigned, which role, which team, or which member is working on this right now, who's assigned to, and this can easily be planned and rearranged as well. So if I go into this release and I click on the planner here at the top, I can assign items to this release. So I click on plan, and here on the left-hand side, I see my release structure, and at the bottom, I see the product backlog, which basically includes all of the items in the system or in this project that I haven't assigned to any of the sprints or releases yet. And I can just do that with a simple drag and drop. So I have this Bluetooth task here, for example. Let's say I want to complete this in sprint 1.1, and I just assign this here and implement touchscreen login interface. I'm going to complete that in sprint 1.2, and this statistical overview will also be updated. So as you can see, this number of items and the story points has gone on up. And if I go back, I see now I have more items planned, more story points committed, and this is also updated. And I can also manage this entire release on a Kanban board. So if I switch to the Kanban board, I have here more columns than 4, but this can be configured so you can remove columns, add columns, rename them, and the workflow of each item is also mapped to this Kanban board. So here I have a requirement that if I start dragging, depending on how the workflow is mapped and what my state transitions allow that I've configured, I have different options. So I can define this requirement, or I can accept a requirement, or approve it, sorry. And then this bug, for example, I have different options here. So I can resolve this bug or close a bug because I have a different workflow set up for it. Here in the draft, I have free capacity because that's how I set up my work in progress limits, and my to-do is overloaded, so my team should swarm in on this first column. And then I can also group this into swim lanes. So not just vertically, but horizontally. And this is where I can group it into teams, for example. No team, development team, this is what they're working on right now. This is what the test team is working on. I can group this also into specific members so I can see who is working on what. I'll close the unassigned ones. Yeah, so these are the roles and specific members in this project, and I see who is working on what. Okay, and I can also filter this, of course, and I can view the test coverage of my entire release. So I see an overview of the test coverage of all of the items in this release. So in case it's not covered, in this case it's not covered because I haven't generated any test cases yet, but I would see the overview here as well. Okay, so there's a bunch of more things that I could show you, but that wraps up the demonstration part of the webinar because I've already gone over time. It was planned for half an hour, but it's now been 40 minutes, so I will now answer any questions that you will have or might have. Okay, I already have 5, so let me see. Okay, so the first question is, how about the safety standard asking to show requirement tracing? How match this to user stories in Agile process? Okay, yeah, so obviously for safety critical development, you have to show full gapless traceability to prove how you developed your product. And in that case, you just have to decide where you want to put requirements and user stories in your process. So, I mean, the safety standards, you still have to prove, you still have to be compliant, and you can be compliant in an Agile process because you still have to do integration and testing, and you have to prove quality assurance, you have to have traceability, which doesn't really conflict with the Agile methodology. You just have to set it up in a correct way. So in this case, I would say requirements are one level above, and then you would derive user story from your requirements. That's one way to do it. Or you can just leave out requirements altogether. And if the functional and non-functional parts are well defined in the user stories, then I would say you don't necessarily need requirements. So if they have good acceptance criteria and they're broken down into specific tasks with good well-defined definition of done's, then I wouldn't necessarily hold on to requirements. But other than that, they would somewhere be above user stories to have the traceability. So you have to decide on what level you're going to manage them. Okay. Okay, so next one is, hello, I want to implement Agile to my current testing team. I don't know the plans I feel to implement for my team at the beginning. Okay, so you're at the beginning of implementing Agile. How can I implement Agile for testing when development team is following Waterfall? Okay, well, that's pretty difficult. I mean, the development process, the entire development process should follow one type of methodology. I would say it's pretty difficult to implement testing with Agile. I would have to think that through. Honestly, I can't give you a good answer right now. If your team is developing Waterfall, then obviously the testing is going to be at the end of development, which makes it pretty difficult to use an Agile methodology for testing. You can still use, the Kanban board to manage the items or the test. No, I don't know. It doesn't sound like it's a very good idea, I'd have to say. Just because of the strict phases of a waterfall, it comes at the end. Testing comes at the end. So I don't know how you could do iterations of development, because usually you follow iterations of development where you test at the end of an iteration. So I can't really answer that. Okay, next one is how to deal with late requirements. Requirements, user stories which come up after development already started. One or more sprints already done, which may not match to already made architecture decisions, especially with respect to safety. Ooh, that's a good question. I'll have to think about that as well. Let me get back to you on that. Maybe we can answer that offline. But what I could imagine on the top of my head is adding change requests, which then goes through to a change control board. So you could define if it's related to some part of the development, you can report a change request, which can then go through a change control board. And depending on the impact analysis that you do, you can decide if you accept that change request and it's still worth for you to go back and work on that. So, with respect to safety, that's the cleanest way to do it. So you have to have, obviously, traceability. You have to have it reported. It has to go through a change control board. It has to be accepted. It has to be reviewed. And then I guess you could implement it if you feel like the benefits outweigh the cost. And that could be done, for example, with a traceability matrix that I showed you in CodeBeamer. You can report in the traceability matrix, you actually kind of have an impact analysis. So if I go back, let's see if I have that here. Traceability matrix, load manage presets, preset 1. Yeah, epics. Okay, so I don't have this set up right now, but what you could do in a way is actually you can have these relationships propagate suspected links. And let me show you an example for that. Let me jump into another project here. And the way that works is it actually shows you in the entire traceability matrix here. If some change, for example, you have a safety goal here after item definition. This isn't Agile anymore. Just I'm showing you the functionality. If you have report a change request here in your safety goal, for example, or let's say in this hardware requirement, safety requirements. This can be software safety requirements, whatever. Then you can see that there's these gray suspected links. And if I change something here or I report a change request, then that will affect everything down the line in this matrix. And then they will be marked with a red suspected link. And that will show you kind of an impact analysis of what these changes will affect and what the impact will be down the line in your development. Okay. Next question is, how different is the tool from Jira and other ALM tools, and with respect to code quality, apart from test coverage, any other metrics also covered, tracked? Okay, so I mean, Jira is more of a bug tracking or an issue tracking system. You can expand it, of course, to an ALM tool, but then it's going to be not a single point solution, or not a complete holistic solution, but it's going to be more of an integrated tool suite of single point solutions. So that makes traceability a bit more difficult. Um, and other ALM tools, could you be a bit more specific with which one you mean? With respect to code quality, I mean, if I go back, we have an integration with Jenkins. So out of the box testing is only manual in codeBeamer. And then for automated tests and code coverage and unit tests and things like that, we have an integration with Jenkins. We have a few videos on that on our website and a few webinars as well. So that's kind of a much more different topic. But you can import your unit test cases and the results of those and link them back to your requirements or user stories or specific tasks. And then you have the coverage of your automated tests as well, your code coverage as well. And you can also, of course, commit code to specific tasks. And then you can comment on every line of code. So what I mean by that is, if I go back to here, for example, here I have this epic user story task, and I reported a bug to this task, and I have 2 Git commits that I committed into the system to this bug. So now if I go into the bug itself, I open the detailed view of this bug, and this SCM commits, I actually see the code itself that I've committed, and all I have to do is when I do a commit, I just reference the ID in the comment section of the commit. And then I can comment on every single line of code. So okay, so next question. Next question is, what we are doing at our companies, as you said, by having a Kanban board and visualized testing tasks on it. Okay, so thank you for the feedback. Shilpa Shri, if you're still here, that's then a good, I guess. And does it work, or how is is that in relation to the waterfall and the testing agile? Is that a feedback to that, Fadi? Okay, so next question. How is CodeBeamer more flexible than Microsoft Test Management tool for all testing activities? I have to be honest, I'm not familiar with Microsoft Test Management. Okay, so I'd have to Google that really quick. Will CodeBeamer support automation testing? Yeah, so like I said, in this integration with Jenkins, we have support for automated testing, for unit tests, and code coverage and things like that. So on our website, we have a few webinars and videos on that. Yeah, okay. I don't think I'm gonna right now, but we can take it offline, Shilpashri, and then we can talk about it in more detail. So, and I'll kind of prepare and look up that Microsoft testing. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. We can talk about that offline. So, does anybody have any other questions? I will leave it open for a few more minutes. Otherwise, the next webinar in our Agile Summer class is going to be specifically for safety critical development and more specifically for medical device development. And it's going to be kind of a customer success story and a case study of how one of the largest medical device development firms successfully uses CodeBeamer in an agile environment. So that's going to be pretty interesting. Okay, so no other questions, then thank you for your attention and make sure you join us on August 16th for part 2 of the Agile Summer Classes. And everybody have a nice day. Bye bye.